This is Phoebe Smith with Restorative Practices Integration Associates, and I am so honored to be here with my friend Ramsay Boly, a fellow Restorative Practices practitioner. We have worked together over the last couple of years doing restorative practices trainings and really starting to learn more and grow in the work ourselves as practitioners, as our friendship grows. As you know, we are doing these spotlights on our website each month with practitioners. Again, just me trying to get out there in the community and bond and grow with people who are doing this work in the world as well. And as Ramsay will share with you a little bit later, that Ramsay was here in California with me, but is now in Dakar, Senegal, with his family. And so the work is expanding in regards to where we are and where we're showing up to do this work. And so I'm trying to keep us all connected and in community with each other so that we feel supported in the work that we do. So I'm so excited and privileged to being able to continue to work with Ramsay. So I'll just go ahead and get us started. Ramsay, why don't you introduce yourself by telling us a little bit about your journey as into becoming a restorative practices practitioner and some of the specific areas that you really lean into inside of your work.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your spotlight. It's an honor. I feel
Absolutely.
so special. Yeah. And yeah, no, I'm so appreciative of our partnership and continued collaboration and growing friendship through this work.
Me too.
So yeah, I'll try my best to answer this first question. It's kind of hard to pinpoint a beginning point for when my restorative practice journey would have started. There's definitely moments that I feel like, or periods of my life that I feel like set me up for the path of being a restorative practice practitioner or conflict transformation practitioner. And I think the first one is just the land and the cultures and people of Burkina Faso, where I grew up in West Africa, where a lot of the values that are now termed as restorative practice are just a part of the culture there, right? And embodied in many ways. And so I think I grew up there until I was 14 and I moved to the US for high school and then stayed in the US for my college and graduate studies. And I'm now back in Senegal, Dakar with my family. But it was the exposure that I had growing up to the culture in West Africa that I think gave me the foundation gave me something that really connected and resonated and linked to the term restorative justice when I was first exposed to that in California, right? And it wasn't until I was a grad student that the term restorative justice that I came across that and had the opportunity to really engage and practice that. And so it was just something that aligned with the values that I already had that I didn't necessarily have the language or frameworks to make sense of in that way. But it was just like, oh, this view of conflict, this view of harm and community just really resonates with something with me. So that's why that was like the moment where I was like, oh yes, I want to do restorative practice was when I first took a restorative justice training in California. But during that training, that was kind of the process that happened internally. I was like, oh, these values really resonate with me. And the reason that was because there was something familiar in me that it struck a chord with, and that was the values that were instilled in me growing up in West Africa. So that's kind of the foundation I think that led to it. Um, and then it's also become something that has converged with my own spiritual journey and practice, which, yeah, is something that you and I have discussed a lot about how we intuitively see restorative practices to align with that, and how a big need and potential challenge is being able to merge those and bring those together in the same space. Um, so I'd say that's my first stab at what my journey looked like so far.
Yeah, and I'm just hearing you say too that as a part of your journey, that in this idea of indigenous practices reminds me of one of the first trainings that we did together. And I knew even before we started, or we were just getting to know each other, that that you definitely felt like some spiritual pull, some spiritual groundedness in restorative practices. And then as we were moving along in getting familiar with the material, I had said, I remember saying, I'm not that comfortable doing land acknowledgments. So I'll just talk about current events. And you're like, hold on. Like, wait a minute. We have to do land acknowledgments, right?
Yeah.
So just say a little bit more about like the connection that we are modern day feeling, practitioners are feeling about restorative practices and the indigenous roots, and how those two worlds are coming back together, right? Like the fact that restorative practices are indigenous practices and we're now rediscovering them. And so we're trying to honor that, right? We must honor that, so that we don't appropriate and take away even more so from people who've already been taken away from and stolen from enough. So also to giving credit where credit is due, but also like just in terms of our own internal, personal, spiritual, cellular alignment with these practices. What are some of your thoughts in that regard, in terms of the connection of it being indigenous and how it speaks to you on a cellular internal level?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, that's a hot topic question right there. Can only speak from my experience, right? Because there's a lot of different views on this very hot topic at the moment, especially with the continuous rise and popularization and commodification of restorative practices. So I'll start with the land acknowledgement. That's a good point of entry. I think for me, the land acknowledgement is important and a must do, right? And especially in a restorative practice or restorative justice training, a circle practice training, because as you mentioned, these are indigenous practices, right? And so at least recognizing that is just a first step. It by no means is enough. It's just a first step. That's better than before, where there was absolutely no acknowledgement, right? And where the roots and the wisdoms of indigenous traditions and knowledge systems were silenced and ignored, right? At least giving a voice to remind us that, wait a minute, we are actually benefiting from their wisdom and tradition, whether we're aware of it or not, right? And that's just the first step for many more steps that must happen, and many people are leading that fight for reparations. So from my end, I think that I guess this goes back to the first question of my journey to restorative practice, where I'm at a point where I am kind of seeing it as being more than just a practice, right? It's more than just a hat that I put on for work. It has to become something that's embodied. And what the language that I'm currently working with and making to make sense of it is I'm like, my worldview is shifting, right? And so I've been reading a little bit and seeing what other thinkers, indigenous leaders, healers, and shamans speak to this, and they talk about the indigenous worldview against the modern worldview. And so I kind of see myself in this moment making that shift from the modern worldview, which I've been conditioned and socialized to embody, to shift into the indigenous. Because even though I grew up in Burkina Faso, I grew up in a more modern sphere, modern cultural sphere, and that has long colonial legacies tied to that. And so I've really had to recently do the work internally to like unpack that. I'm still doing it and try to make this transition. And so part of that worldview is also acknowledging and understanding humans as being part of nature, being part of the land, right? And so that's another reason why I think the land acknowledgement is so important, because when we engage in circle practice, not only do we engage in indigenous practices that we want to acknowledge and honor, but if you do reinstate kind of the original culture and context from which these indigenous traditions arise, these are sacred practices, right, in many ways. And so the land is sacred in many ways. And so when we engage in these practices that center community and relationship building and healing, we have to acknowledge the sacredness of the land that's a part of here, the land that's holding us to do this work, that's holding us through our lives, that's providing us everything to get to this point, right? And so not acknowledging that is also, for me, a continued way of silencing the greater context of these practices, right? Because modernity is now in this place where it's like, oh, like indigenous folks had some things right? But we still also cut off a lot of the entire worldview from which these things came, right? We only want to pick and choose what seems to satisfy our needs in the moment versus being like, actually, the whole world, there's a whole worldview here that has so much wisdom to offer, and in my view is the one that might be needed to counter a lot of the catastrophes that we're experiencing at a global level. And so, like, what becomes a really hot topic in that question is around like who has the right to learn, to practice these practices, and to teach these practices, right? Because then we come against the reality of cultural appropriation, which has been happening for a long time on this land and globally, whitewashing and commodifying practices. And so, again, that becomes a very difficult question where different practitioners will have different point of views depending on their tradition, depending on their experience. I've recently kind of found myself thinking and appreciating the view that, well, everyone on this earth is indigenous to this earth, right? But we have different relationships as it stands and positionalities in relationship to what indigeneity is. And we have to, part of the work of re-embracing indigeneity and that worldview for me has to also entail doing that self-work and that reflection and looking at our ancestry. How did that relate to the systems of oppression that continue to perpetuate harm and steal land from indigenous folks across the world? So it's not just a matter of like, oh yeah, I'm indigenous of this earth, I can just do indigenous practices. There's a whole healing and reckoning process that has to come with it, right? So for me, it kind of feels like everyone has an inherent right to this worldview and wisdom and healing in a sense, but also like there's responsibility that comes with that due to the historical context we find ourselves in, the positionalities that we are in this life with that situates us in certain ways, right? And so I feel like those kind of dictate a little bit the responsibilities. So
because I've been thinking about this, right? About historically our society. And as I was sharing with you that I'm writing this article about, if we have restorative practices, do we need Black History Month? If we are actually practicing it, if we were actually practicing it as a society, my answer to that question is no. we don't need to distinguish particular times of the year just to give people like acknowledgement for specific times of the year, because in restorative practices, you're valued and included all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is no need to have that distinctive time to acknowledge your a group's contributions. If we don't marginalize a people, then we don't need to have things in place so that they feel included or valued. Their stories are being told and they're being heard, and we are knowledgeable about those things. But we have things like Black History Month because we have silenced, like you were saying earlier, we've silenced groups of people, their practices, their traditions, and replace them with those of the colonizer. And so they have been not only ripped away from us as a part of this society, but also even in our own efforts to celebrate and to continue to practice those ways of being, like those are snuffed out as well over time from a historical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about in terms of our society, how can we as practitioners bring forth this work? Like that's I think that's the overarching goal for all of the people who are, leading the way in this work, to implement it in all the spaces that we live and work. To come to the point where with restorative practices, engaging with each other in a restorative way, that then it prevents us from having to address the fact that people have been marginalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that we live inside of a system and function inside of this these systems of exclusion and devaluing versus inclusion and valuing. So what are your thoughts about that in terms of how we can take something like a Black History Month and implement restorative practices, the work that we're doing in restorative practices, and how that actually eradicates the need for these things that people perceive as being good things or positive things?
I agree with, the statement that if we were a restorative society, like we wouldn't need Black History Month or similar programs, because if we were restorative, because Black History Month and other such programs are part of a struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're a struggle for people who find themselves on the disempowered side of colonization,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if we were a restorative society and we were a society that maintained that worldview, the harm that had been caused wouldn't have gotten to this scale, right? And there's many ways to look at and understand that, but because when we do restorative practices, we talk about healing and accountability for harm caused, right? So if we were truly a restorative society rather than a punitive one, a lot of these things we would have had a very different course, I believe, right? And it's a lot of people will start making the argument, well, you don't know what would have happened, it's the what ifs. But I think also for me it comes back again to the difference in worldviews, right? If we look at the modern worldview that really shapes our behaviors, our cultures, our philosophies, like we're looking at a more recent history of colonization, which is war and conquest and exploitation, which creates a bias and a muscle for punitive behaviors, right? And which eradicated the systems prior, which were more restorative and were, as I said, folks were again part of nature, and that also meant that the way of life, the worldview, was to be in harmony and in a way that honors the ecosystem, right? The material capabilities of the ecosystem, as well as beyond material. So in that sense, like there's a sense of harmony that where it becomes harder to imagine an exploitative system at the scale that we have seen that colonialism was, and that modernity continues to function on that function at a global economic scale, right? So I think that it's movements and actions such as, you know, having Black History Month and other popular movements for social justice are important. They're an important part of the step. And when we talk about like systems transformation, like I don't think it's a conversation where there's one correct answer. I think it's something where there has to be action done on so many levels, that the question becomes more about like, what can I do as an individual, right? And so I think that goes back to one thing you asked, which is how do we as practitioners contribute to that and bring that work forward? Which I think for me, my answer to that goes back to the thought of like embodying this worldview, but like just what are you as an individual? What are your gifts that you have to bring to this world, right? Because everyone comes with gifts and capacities and strengths. And if they can flourish those, I think that that's where like a lot of change can happen in community, at the community level and even at the greater level. So it becomes a matter of being able to decolonize the self in a sense and break away from the prescribed expectations and prescribed life journeys that were given by society to really cultivate that innate gift, right, and give it back to community. But the thing is, it's complicated because you do also require community to do that, right? We're not necessarily able to do that on our own. We can't break away from love community and be like, I'm gonna go find myself. You also need a community that nurtures your authenticity. So it becomes, it's kind of it's a big endeavor to take on. But for me, like this, my entry point, I think the starting point is that point of cultivating authenticity in ourselves, but with community, right? Having that being recognized by community and being nourished by community, and you doing that to community in some other way.
Part of the question, which is, what does restorative practices look like in your professional life? What are you bringing? What are you imagining over there to bring into the world through your practice? What does it all look like for you, do you think?
Yeah, well, so very much still figuring that out, in the process of working that out, and you're being a partner with me in that process, which I appreciate. So like as I mentioned, I just put together a first website for my practice, so working on getting myself out there, and in the process working on really figuring out what it is I want to focus on as a restorative justice practitioner. Like I do have, as we've collaborated on leading trainings in restorative practice and mediation and other modalities. So I really do enjoy training and engaging with folks in that way. And also we have experience as conflict transformation practitioners, providing direct services such as mediation or circles, for harm circles and such. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of, those are the experiences that I have, the professional experiences I have entering this new phase of my own practice. And there's other personal experiences as well that come into the picture. And mainly, I would say for me, the spiritual one, that I'm really trying to merge with that. And the spiritual one is very much a journey that I'm undertaking, that it's very much aligned with a journey I'm undertaking to kind of rediscover my own indigeneity, right? On my father's side and on my mother's side. So on my mother's side, there's European ancestry from Scotland and Sweden primarily. And on my dad's side, West African, he's Fula Burkinabe, Fula Burkinabe. And so, as I mentioned earlier, like I think part of the embodying of this worldview, which I want my practice to be about, is to do that ancestral work, ancestral healing, ancestral reckoning, and stuff. So, and that's aligned with where my spiritual practice is at right now, and kind of exploring that realm. And so that's something that I hope to bring to that I hope to bring and offer to community and folks through my services. So restorative justice and, bringing the ritual aspect of it and trying to do so in integrity with the roots of the practice and my own ancestors. Yeah, and so it's navigating how to honor that, and then like you said, navigating the needs for, okay, well, I do need to make money, I do need to do all those things, but I believe I'm at a stage where I still believe that all of that can be done and met correctly. So and I also believe that we're just at a point, it seems like we're at a point in society where there's this collective calling and yearning for this type of wisdom and knowledge, right? Because there's just so many, the failures of our modern systems are just being more and more obvious, and so we're like, okay, well, we went terribly wrong somewhere, and so I think this is an important opportunity for pausing and again reconsidering these alternative ways of being in relationship with each other, with the world, and with the self.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ramsay, for taking the time out. I know it's nighttime there for you, morning here for me. So thank you so much for taking the time out to talk with us and to share your perspectives. And